Okay, so this is part two. So we're going to talk about using RFT to improve abilities in young people with intellectual disabilities and autism. And we're going to talk about RFT for use with older adults with dementia. So PEAK is a relational training system that is used, as I said, to improve skills and abilities in young people, typically with autism, but can be applied to young people with intellectual disabilities as well. So we've discovered that it is possible to train equivalence relations. So again, remember back in the RFT lecture, I spoke about the fact that relational framing and understanding that if A is equal to B, then B is equal to A isn't something that comes naturally. It's something that we're taught. And we're able to teach and we're able to train equivalence relations, stimulus equivalence, just like operant behavior. So we're able to train these relations as a form of operant behavior. So our improvement in the ability to relationally respond should lead to improved abilities in the areas of cognition, language, and intelligence. So as we saw from the IQ improvements, if we can teach people to relate and teach people to relationally frame things and improve their relational scores and relational abilities, then we can also see improvements in their language, their intelligence, and their cognition. So Mark Dixon created this PEAK program. PEAK stands for Promoting the Emergence of Advanced Knowledge. So it does two things. So it uses traditional ABA techniques and it uses Skinner's original verbal operant behavior definitions. It talks about tacts and mans and all those things we spoke about previously, but it also develops on this and it talks about RFT and uses RFT based training as well. So it uses traditional accounts of verbal behavior and operant conditioning and reinforcement, etc., and looks at verbal behavior in terms of tacts and mans. But then it also goes on and talks about derived relational responding, stimulus equivalence, and relationships between stimuli that we don't need to train. It talks about arbitrarily applicable relational responding. So the ability to be able to derive relations and engage in arbitrarily applicable relational responding is responsible for our ability to understand and use abstract language. So again, remember, AA or arbitrarily applicable relational responding is really key in RFT because it teaches us how to relate stimuli to each other at an abstract level. Language is abstract. So PEAK aims to improve arbitrarily applicable relational responding. So as I said, PEAK stands for Promoting the Emergence of Advanced Knowledge, and it has an assessment part to it and it has a curriculum effectively. So it has a set of tasks and skills and things that therapists and teachers can do with young people with intellectual disabilities or autism to try to improve their skills and ability. So it's broken down into 4 sections or 4 modules. These are called the direct training section or the direct training module, the generalization module, the equivalence module, and the transformation module. So you should recognize generalization there. So generalization, if we think back to, for example, Watson and we think back to little Albert, he generalized his fear to all white furry things. So generalization relating to how we understand other stimuli more than just the stimuli that we're taught with. So expanding our knowledge and our understanding. So for example, being able to generalize, if you teach a child the word cat, being able to generalize that the word cat doesn't just relate to that one specific picture of a cat that you show them, that the word cat relates to a yellow cat, it relates to a black cat, it relates to a big cat, it relates to a small cat, so that they can generalize the word cat. Equivalence, then, we've spoken about equivalence and stimulus equivalence. So understanding that the word cat is the same as the picture cat, and the picture cat is the same as the written word cat. So each module, each of these training modules or each of these training sections has 184 programs. So there's a lot of training provided and there's a lot of opportunity for training and learning. You don't have to do them all. You don't have to teach them all to kids. The therapist or the teacher doesn't have to go through each and every one of them. But there's a lot of different options there to help develop important language skills and to help develop important skills that the young person needs. So as we said, it's kind of a merger of the traditional ABA accounts of language and also relational frame theory account of language and understanding. So within each section, practitioners are given detailed instructions on how to carry out assessments and also how to develop the client's language abilities, their skill ranges, etc., etc. So each program has goals. It recommends what kind of materials should be used, what stimuli should be used, and it gives instruction on how to carry out the training with the child and how to collect the data. Because again, data is really important to be able to see the progress for the child. So the training module, so again, I said they're broken down into 4 modules. The training module is designed to assess and teach language skills and is based on the traditional ABC design, where responses are reinforced in the presence of an appropriate discriminative stimulus. So, a picture of a cat is shown. If the child says cat, they get reinforcement. So typical ABC, antecedent being the discriminative stimulus, so the antecedent being the picture of a cat in the presence of this discriminative stimulus, which is the picture of the cat. If the child engages in the behavior of saying the word cat, this is just an example, of saying the word cat, then they get reinforcement. So the first module or the first section of PEAK, very much classical ABA based. The second one is also classical kind of ABA based, and it focuses on learning the ability to extend the learned responses to similar but non-identical stimuli. So initially you might, for example, train the word cat with a picture of a black cat. So you show the child a picture of a black cat, they say the word cat and they get reinforcement. You establish that behavior, you make it fluent. So this is what happens within the direct training module. Then within the generalization module, you get them to respond with the word cat when they're shown not just a picture of a black cat, but a picture of an orange cat, or a picture of a fat cat, or a picture of a cartoon cat, or a picture of a real cat, so that it's able to generalize to similar but not identical stimuli. So both of these procedures are pretty much based in traditional ABA and operant conditioning. So ABC, antecedent behavior consequence, the antecedent being a discriminative stimulus, the behavior being the behavior that you want to establish in the child. And again, you can use shaping and chaining, etc., etc. Schedules of reinforcement, all those classical ABA techniques. Where it differs then, and where it changes, is when we come to modules 3 and modules 4. So the final 2 modules are the PEAK equivalence and the PEAK transformation. So these are our 2 RFT-based modules. So these are based on stimulus equivalence and relational frame theory. So again, we've spoken about stimulus equivalence and we've spoken about relational frame theory before. So if you want to recap, go back and listen to those videos or look at those slides. So PEAK is able to teach verbal skills where meaning transfers to stimuli without direct training. So again, remember, part of the key assumption of stimulus equivalence and relational frame theory is that we don't have to teach every single relationship, that there are some certain taught relationships and then there are some relationships which we derive by ourselves. However, the skill at being able to derive these relationships ourselves is something that we have to teach. So we can teach that skill, but then once that skill is established, they're able to transfer meaning to new stimuli without the direct training. So this is done by, as I said, providing examples and training up the ability to derive relations between stimuli and for them to happen naturally, but we train them up like any kind of operant behavior. So again, initially we might have to train the relationship between the fact that the word cat is the same as an image of a cat and an image of a cat is the same as the word cat. But then once that skill is established, they're able to derive further relations by themselves without direct training. So PEAK E or PEAK equivalence begins by testing for the basic stimulus equivalence skills. So those basic combinatorial entailment, mutual entailment, those basic skills that we spoke about previously. In fact, at the basic level of PEAK, they just look to see do they have the mutual entailment. So if A is the same as B, B is the same as A. So do children have that skill or do children have that ability to be able to understand that? So PEAK T then, the PEAK transformation, this looks at and tries to address any problems with relational responding, including equivalence, but also moves into, because as we've said, we know that RFT is more than just A is the same as B is the same as C. We can talk about A being the opposite to B being bigger than C. So that means then that C is bigger than B is smaller than C, B is the opposite to A is opposite to B, etc. So peak T moves on from equivalence and talks about things like opposites, difference, bigger than, smaller than, me versus you, he versus she, etc., etc. So peak T starts with teaching non-arbitrary relational tasks. So again, remember we spoke about non-arbitrary versus arbitrary relations. So go back and have a look at that if you forget anything about that. But non-arbitrary being based on the physical properties. So the peak T might start with non-arbitrary relations, such as sorting things by size, sorting things by color. Then it might move into kind of more arbitrary based ones. So the word pig being related to a non-arbitrary stimulus, which is bigger, but the word pig meaning a bigger animal than the word ant. Again, it's kind of arbitrary because the word pig shouldn't or naturally infer that it's a bigger animal, but we're beginning to teach this relation. And then I move on to more complex relations involving really arbitrary stimuli. So these are the 4 modules. So we have the direct training module, the generalization module, the equivalence module, and the transformation module. And then we have skills or tasks that are trained within those. So basic learning skills or foundational learning skills you can see there in the direct training module, perceptual learning skills, verbal understanding skills, verbal reasoning, memory, maths, etc. So you can see the 2 arrows going in terms of increasing complexity, both across the modules and within the modules themselves. So if we move down to the equivalence module, you can see there that they're talking about relational skills and equivalence relational skills. Then if you move into the transformation module, you can see there that they're talking about non-arbitrary relations. Then they talk about arbitrary coordination and then complex arbitrary relations as well. So a variety of kind of traditional ABA-based reinforcement, teaching language, etc. Now, obviously, reinforcement is going to be used throughout all of this program, but basic ABA kind of based skills in our first 2 modules, and then more RFT based skills in our equivalence and transformational modules. So the last application of RFT that I'm going to talk about is using RFT with older adults to try to prevent or to try to delay dementia. Now, I need to preface this section by saying that this is Dr. Michelle Kelly's area of interest, and this is her speciality in terms of RFT. And my original plan had been for Dr. Michelle Kelly to come in and talk to you. You haven't had Dr. Kelly yet. She works in NCI and is a behavioural researcher like myself, and you'll have her next year. But her special area of behavioural interest and behavioural psychology is the use of RFT with dementia. So I'd like to thank Dr. Michelle Kelly for giving me these resources and these slides. So this is Dr. Michelle Kelly's content. So how can behavior analysts help to prevent or help to delay dementia? There's been a lot of research into dementia, what causes it, and how can we prevent it, delay it, or potentially stop it. And a lot of the literature proposes some pretty basic and simple things. And the best things to help stave off dementia are modifiable lifestyle factors. So they're things that we can change, they're things that we can influence, they're things that we can do to try to reduce the risk of developing dementia later on in life. And they're very practical and very easy things to do. So things like high levels of exercise, high levels of social engagement and social interaction, having a degree of a high Mediterranean diet, and some level of cognitive training. So these factors, when we look at the literature, when we do a systematic review of the literature, and when we look at a meta-analysis, these factors are seen to be the most significant things that we can do to try to prevent or stave off dementia. So we need to start thinking from a behavioural point of view about how we can design effective interventions to target these lifestyle protective factors. So for the first few, for exercise, social engagement, Mediterranean diet, these should be easy for behavior analysts. We can design interventions based on reinforcement, based on punishment, based on schedules of reinforcement, based on prompting, discriminative stimuli, etc., to try to improve exercise, social engagement, etc., etc. So we can create interventions pretty easily for these factors here. But what about cognitive training? Can behavior analysts and behavioral psychologists develop cognitive training interventions using behavioral based techniques and theories and technologies that might be effective to help stop cognitive decline or to help stave off dementia? So again, can we design cognitive training interventions based on behavioral psychology that might affect improving cognition and functioning? So there are a lot of cognitive training programs out there and game training programs that, as we spoke about when we were talking about IQ, they focus on memory and they focus on working memory and to some degree this idea of processing speed. So some internal cognitive processing thing that happens that they're trying to improve the speed of. But again, remember, from a behavioral point of view, we're always trying to focus on socially significant behaviors and improving socially significant behaviors. So if we're to consider socially significant behaviors from a cognitive point of view, these should be things that relate to improvements in real life cognition. So thought processes that are useful for daily day-to-day life for people with dementia potentially. So a lot of the brain training programs and games, are they really applicable for real life situations? Are they useful or beneficial for people with dementia, or are they a bit abstract? Even from our behavioral point of view, how do we make sure that what we're targeting, what we're looking at when we're improving or trying to improve cognitive skills are socially significant and are going to help improve the lives of people with dementia? So a lot of research has told us from a cognitive point of view that the core executive functions are critical. So core executive functions are really important for performing everyday to-day tasks. These core executive functions include things like inhibition and interference control and a concept called cognitive flexibility. So cognitive flexibility is the ability to shift between competing activities or competing trains of thoughts and for us to be able to inhibit impulse or dominant response preferences. So what you often see with people with dementia is that they become very impulsive and very erratic in their behaviors. And partly this is thought to be because their impulse control abilities are reducing as their cognitive abilities decline. So cognitive flexibility is the ability to be able to switch between trains of thought, but it also involves having a level of cognitive inhibition or being able to stop yourself, etc. And these skills then also relate to IQ and a concept called cognitive reserve. So you might remember we spoke about cognitive reserve when we spoke about dementia and Alzheimer's in the biological basis of behavior module. So cognitive reserve being an idea that the increased levels of cognitive ability that you have based on education, social interaction, etc., is going to help you prevent dementia. So cognitive flexibility and core executive functions are really important to target, and they relate to IQ levels and cognitive reserve levels. So what do behavior analysts know about flexibility? So from doing your ACT assignment, and we'll talk about it more next week, but you should be kind of familiar with this idea of flexibility. So typically we talk about flexibility in terms of psychological flexibility. But we can compare psychological flexibility to cognitive flexibility or cognitive rigidity. So rigid thinking or very strict rule-governed, very strict thinking can interfere with learning. So we see oftentimes that when people are very rigid or not flexible in their thoughts, or they have cognitive rigidity or lacking flexibility, this can create rules, so they've got very strict rules that dictate their lives. So we often see this in young people with autism or young people with intellectual disabilities, that they've got very strict rules. For example, they might have to follow a certain routine at a certain time every single day. Lunch might only be a certain kind of sandwich because that's their rule, and they are very rigid and they don't have flexibility. So very rigid forms of thinking can be detrimental. So from an RFT point of view, again, RFT looks at complex, flexible relational responding, and it's positively associated, as we saw from the previous literature. Improving relational responding is associated with IQ improvements and cognitive performance improvements in children and young adults. So, as we've said, improvements in complex relational responding and the ability to be able to teach and learn complicated relational responding relates to flexibility in language abilities and in cognitive processes. So, when we're talking about relational responding again is our ability to respond to one thing based on its relationship to another. So, here we can look at these two people and we can relate or respond to these two stimuli in terms of older and younger. The man on the right is older than the boy on the left. The boy on the left is younger than the man on the right. The boy on the left is faster than the man on the right. The man on the right is slower than the boy on the left. So we've got older, younger, faster, slower. We can do bigger, smaller. So we can relate and respond to one thing based on its relationship to the other. So when we're talking then about relational responding, we also previously spoke about arbitrary and non-arbitrary. So again, remember, arbitrary is when the relationship between two things isn't based on physical properties of those two things. So for example, if both of these people are trying to develop IQ training programs or dementia training programs, or whatever it might be, if I say that, for example, her cognitive training program is better than his, you understand the relationship between the two training programs. And if I just tell you that her cognitive training program is better than his, I don't tell you anything about his, but you're then able to derive that his cognitive training program is worse than hers. So you're deriving relations here, but they're not based on any physical properties of the cognitive training program. They're based on arbitrary words. So you're relating based on an arbitrary frame of better than. And then derived, as I said, is that example of if I just tell you that her training system is better than his, you derive by yourself that his is worse than hers. So again, a response is derived, or a response is derived when it hasn't been explicitly stated. So if A equals B and B equals C, then you can figure out the rest. You can understand that A equals C, etc. So this complex relational responding and this ability to arbitrarily derive relational responding can have an influence, as we've said, on our cognitive abilities, on our IQ levels, etc., etc. So training in complex relational responding, such as arbitrarily applicable relational responding, has been shown to improve IQ scores in maths and reading abilities and overall general IQ scores. There's some research that we've spoken about already. But what the research has also indicated is that those with higher IQ scores also demonstrate a greater degree of relational flexibility. And this is thought to be central to the development of superior cognitive processes. So when we go back to this and when we look at a cognitive view of dementia, and when we look at cognitive points of view for how we stop dementia, as we said, from a cognitive point of view, core executive functions are really important for everyday tasks. A level of cognitive flexibility is important, and IQ relating to improved cognitive functioning. So if then we take relational frame theory, and what does relational frame theory add to this? Relational frame theory is interested in improving individuals' relational flexibility. So how do they relate stimuli to each other? So there's research indicating that relational flexibility is effectively the same as cognitive flexibility. And this can help our ability to shift flexibly between different patterns of relational responses. So as opposed to talking about it in terms of cognitive processes, you can see here we have it as the ability to shift flexibly between competing activities or competing trains of thought. But if we turn this into behavioral terms, the ability to be able to shift flexibly between different patterns of relational responses. So again, doing this from a different manner, doing this from a behavioral point of view. And then this can also have a relationship, as we've seen, with improved IQ. Cognitive reserve is one that we haven't quite gotten to grips with yet from a behavioral point of view, so we're not sure of the relationship between relational training and relational improvements in terms of what it does to cognitive reserve, because again, it's a bit of an abstract concept. It's kind of the idea that cognitive reserve is something that's stored in the background for if some of our cognitive abilities decline, then we have backup effectively. So that's a bit of an abstract point of view that from a behavioural point of view we haven't really gotten to grips with yet. So Dr. Kelly and her colleagues have called for individuals to extend RFT research and RFT programs much more so into the area of dementia, and to develop cognitive training interventions that are based in behavioural RFT terms and that are able to improve flexibility and cognition in older adults. So when we're talking about flexibility, again, cognitive flexibility is something that the cognitive psychologists talk about, but when we're talking about flexibility, this is in relation to relational responding. And when flexibility in relational responding is absent or when there's a problem with it, training using computerized behavioral methodologies such as the IRAP can help improve complexity and flexibility of relational responding. So just to pause there before this gets confusing for you, there's two versions of the IRAP. There's something called the T-IRAP, which is a teaching IRAP, which can be used to help teach relational responding. The IRAP that we spoke about previously is just the classic IRAP, and that's the one that we use to assess implicit cognitions. So the IRAP that Dr. Kelly is talking about here is the T-IRAP, so a training version of the IRAP to help train relational responding. So when flexibility in relational responding is not working properly or is broken or deficient or absent, a T-IRAP can help improve people's ability to relate and to engage in relational responding. So the IRAP can also be useful to train and to assess. So the T-IRAP can be used to train relational responding, but then the classic IRAP that we spoke about can be used to assess patterns of arbitrarily applicable relational responding.
So moving forward, Dr. Michelle Kelly has proposed a number of different steps that can be taken in order to advance and improve research using RFT with dementia. So you can see there the kind of list of advice that she has. So she says that we can use non-experimental pre and post designs, and then we should use carefully designed single subject studies to try to demonstrate experimental control. So again, as we spoke about previously, using single subject designs such as a reversal or such as multiple baseline designs to try to establish, are these techniques having an influence on cognitive abilities. She then suggests high quality single subject design, and then if appropriate using a large group to maybe use between group design study to build on the evidence and to build on RFT research, and perhaps then bring it out to a randomized control trial level. So Dr. Kelly is currently involved in a pilot study using RFT-based techniques to help or to try to help improve dementia outcomes. So it's a multi-component pre and post intervention single subject design. So this means that she's got 3 participants. She's assessing them before the intervention and after the intervention, so pre and post. The intervention itself is an 8-week computer-based training program based on relational responding. So kind of like the IQ one that we saw earlier, but it's based on a slightly different model of RFT. So 3 participants before the training and after the training of an 8-week intervention. So her results have indicated so far that the relational training has improved cognitive flexibility, and she used an IRAP to measure cognitive flexibility, or as we'd call it, relational framing flexibility. But it's also improved cognitive functioning as measured by the MOCA, as measured by our friend the Stroop that you guys did last semester, and as measured by the COWAT. So those are all cognitive psychology based assessments of cognitive function. And Dr. Kelly's research indicates that RFT, an 8-week RFT intervention, an 8-week RFT program, has improved cognitive functioning and cognitive flexibility, and also subjective cognitive performances measured by a whole different number of scales. So although, for example, you can see there the memory functioning scale. So although RFT isn't trying to target memory functioning, it seems to be having an improvement on scales that are measuring memory functioning. So here you can see the baseline and the follow-up, so the pre and the post for participant 2. You can see the measure, so the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the Stroop Task Assessment, cognitive ability scales, etc., memory functioning scales, etc., etc. So you can see changes there in terms of the scores. For the memory functioning one, you see a decrease in the score, but you want to see a decrease in the score for that one. And you can see an increase in the score for the cognitive assessment, the Montreal cognitive assessment, and the controlled oral word association test. The Stroop responses are becoming shorter, so that means they're becoming more beneficial. So from a qualitative point of view then, and the intervention was deemed to be socially acceptable. So she's interviewed the participants and they've all found the program, the computer program for relational frame theory, to be very useful, very easy, and socially acceptable. So obviously this is a preliminary basic pilot study that's been carried out by Dr. Kelly, and further research is required. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for this week. Next week, I am going to put up a lot of ACT information. I've put up an article today, I put up a chapter today that talks about RFT, ABA, and ACT. It's a really easy chapter. Please, please read it. It ties the three of them together. It's quite basic. If you're not understanding RFT, this might help you. If you can't see how ABA and RFT and ACT are related, it's a good link between them. So I strongly suggest that you read the chapter of the book that I have up on Moodle today. I have a lot of application of RFT resources on Moodle. There's a document that has IRAP studies in it. There's a few IQ-based studies up there. There's a website actually that is based on Dr. Brian Roach's research. So they have developed a website specifically for training RFT to improve IQ. They have a whole load of resources on that page as well. So there's a lot of information there. So I know it might seem overwhelming. I'm not expecting you to read everything that's there, but just be aware that there's a lot of resources to help you read more, learn more. If you have any questions, please do let me know. I know some of this can be really heavy and really complicated and really confusing, but do let me know if you have any questions whatsoever, and go through all the resources that I've put up there. Even just read the titles and have a look and see what do you want to read or not read, etc., etc. Okay, I'll try to put up all the ACT stuff on Monday. I don't know if that's going to be possible. It'll depend how long it takes me to get it prepared. Recording lectures takes a hell of a long time. So it'll depend how long it takes me to get everything prepared, but I will hopefully aim to have all the ACT content up for you on Monday so you can have it all for next week to help you finish off your assignment.